here, for those of you who came to work here and have stayed, you will realize there's an enormous number of activities there which you can relate to. You got a feel for some of that a few minutes ago when you recognized the passion with which she spoke about the things that she wrote, about her own experiences, both here and going to school in Atlanta. As I said, I just want to react to a few things in the book that relate to UBI. And first of all, let me start off with just rereading something that I wrote 5 years ago because it relates directly to the reference that Dr. Krieger made to Governor Paiwanski and his dream of putting this institution together, having it developed. And this is what I wrote. You may recall that the Jubilee issue of Caribbean Perspectives magazine was devoted to the first 50 years of this institution. The first article specifically stressed that some of Virgin Islands visionaries, like Adolfo Sixto, J. Antonio Jarvis, and others, dreamt of the establishment of an institution of higher learning in the U.S. Virgin Islands as early as the 1930s. So this idea didn't just spring up in 1960. Their dream was not of the type that occurs during sleep, but rather it was a strongly desired goal or response, a dream of the caliber that Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to in his famous Lincoln Memorial speech in August '63. Another dreamer, former Governor Ralph Paiwanski, dreamed in 1962 that the fledgling College of the Virgin Islands would one day mature. Whatever was his dream, it is fairly certain to say that he would have been overwhelmed had he visited UBI on its 50th birthday. And now I want to make specific reference to a number of other things. But before doing so, I want to jump to the end and of what I should be saying at the end, but I want to say it up front so that there is no misunderstanding or misinterpretation of things that will follow. In recent years, we have been conducting a survey among our graduates. And one of the questions we asked them was literally, how do you feel UBI has contributed to your understanding, to your own development, to your growth, to your understanding of diversity? And in 2014 and in 2016, 90 and 91% of the students said that it contributed positively. I think that's a very important index because once you would have read this book, you would recognize we have come a long way. The fact that the current administration had made it possible for students, 9 out of 10 students, to look at each other and recognize that there's something positive here, that it's not about race, it's not about disliking one's ethnicity, but there's something more higher, something more appealing, then that is something that we think is worthy of being stressed. I comment on the early years from 1965 to 1967, largely because that was the period that I was a student here. I think I saw one of my classmates here this morning. Juan Harrigan, you still here? There he is, one of my classmates from that period. There is reference in the book to the way students interacted with each other. And when you talk about 1965, this was before a lot of other activities took place both on the mainland and here. We found that during that period at CBI, in its earliest days, there were these cleavages that began to appear. The Virgin Islands students mostly sat and talked with themselves. The students from the British Islands, they did the same thing, and so did the white students from the mainland. This particular space right here was in fact the cafeteria in those days. And so this is where a lot of the interaction took place, right in this space here. We recognized at that time that there appeared to be some sort of connection between the white students and the white faculty. The book points out that more than 90% of the faculty in those early days were white, as one would expect. And Dr. Krieger did a good job of explaining why that came about and what was the actual impact at the particular time. So while there were these cleavages, there really wasn't what we would call any racial strife or any across-the-board animosity. That was going to develop later when there was the strong impact from stateside on the Virgin Islands itself, particularly CBI in those days. One of my own experiences in relation to that deals with one particular professor who gave me a section to read, because this was a test to determine whether you could speak and be understood or not. My background is a British Caribbean. Came out of St. Kitts, having taught for 2 years, came here to school, and I was given this passage to read, and to my surprise, I was told that I had to go into a speech class because I had an accent. Needless to say, it was my worst class. I felt insulted. I had little interest in it. But I say that only to reflect on what was happening at that particular time in CBI. There was another related incident where one particular professor, actually this is the same one who insisted that I had to take this speech class, he was fond of our local liquor. That's the best way I can say. I was part of a play, The Taming of the Shrew. And I remember 2 nights before the first appearance, we were going through rehearsal, and he came in, it's about 7 o'clock in the evening. He was so drunk, I'll just be forthright. He was so drunk he could not stand up. He was lying on the floor, and he said that is how he will conduct the rehearsal. That's part of the kind of thing that we encountered in those early days. The last of these incidents I refer to is that mentioned in your book, Dr. Krieger, Mr. Alan Grammer. I see his name a number of times in the book. Mr. Grammer at that time was a publisher of some kind. He was putting out magazines. But this particular issue, again, this is when I was a student, my second year here. I was student president at the time, and he put out this issue that said, CBI was a big white elephant. In other words, there was no need for something like that here. And I think, as you described, there was a mathematician who was able to demonstrate that, of course, UBI would be cheaper if it didn't exist. It would be cheaper for the community. Mr. Grammer, because he was well known as having strong opinions against CBI, had put this out, and as student council president, I invited him to come down and defend his views before the students. And this is what we did down in classroom administration. It used to be 101, and that was a big scene because it was a matter of his convincing us, all the faculty, all the students, that we were wasting our time and we were at the wrong place. Needless to say, he did not succeed and he simply went about his business. The following year, to my dismay, as I was in graduate school in Canada, he was killed. Apparently one of those kind of situations where somebody got fed up or was negatively impacted and took that action. Briefly then, I want to turn to that other period when I came back. I came back by this time having worked in the President's office, first President, President Wanless, during one of the summers as I was going to school. Of course, he knew me because these go back to the days of being a student here, etc. At that particular time, students were pretty much engaged in what was happening elsewhere. And so for Black History Month, among other things, at that time, I was a faculty advisor to the committee that was putting on activities relative to Black history. We had a special speaker at that particular time by the name of Walter Rodney. And it was Dale who reminded me this morning what his name was. But Dr. Walter Rodney was a well-known international scholar. He had spent a number of years in East Africa. He came back, living in Guyana, and we invited him up to speak to the students at CBI. It turns out that the morning that he was supposed to speak, there was a class in business administration building, and that class was forced to dismiss when it was announced that this was where Dr. Rodney was going to be speaking to the students. When that was announced, and it was told who he was, what he was going to be doing, most of the students walked out. Most of the students were white students. It bothered me at that time, really bothered me, to the point where I decided I would sit down and write a memo about that incident. Well, as we say in the Caribbean, who tell me to do that? It was one of those periods in my life I don't forget. All of a sudden, when I wrote this memo describing the lack of sensitivity of white students, the lack of trying to understand what it is Black students were saying about celebrating Black History Month, I thought something was missing. And in order to express that disappointment, I wrote this memo and I stuck it up in a few places. It didn't go down well. It was seen as being racist. It was seen as everything else which was intended. And that is, have a little bit of respect for what these Black students were trying to do, what it meant to them, and perhaps there could be better relations among the students. The 1980s, the Black faculty began to exert itself because there were a number of incidents ongoing. As you read the book, it tells you about the struggle that was taking place at CBI between Dr. Wanless and the rest of the faculty, etc. And in the long run, it meant that if the Black faculty did not come together to do things for themselves and to exert their point of view, then things were going to be very negative. Of course, the book goes into some detail about the occupation of the library, as Dr. Krieger explained, and the consequences of that. I encourage you to read the book because there's a lot that you don't know about UBI or CBI that would be useful to read about, and just to know where we came from and where we are today. I can say, I can look back, I am proud of the fact that I was a graduate of CBI, I'm proud that I came back, and I'm glad that I'm still here to enjoy this great institution. Thank you.